Eric Drooker, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
I am delighted that you're here, Eric. I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners of the podcast, just so that they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Right. Well, my name's Eric Drooker, and I'm a graphic novelist, among other things. I suppose you probably know me best from The New Yorker. I've done many covers for them over the years, dozens of covers that you're probably familiar with, because some of them are quite well known. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was on the front cover of The New Yorker. It was a disturbing but humorous image of a businessman, a Wall Street businessman, but we're looking up at him. So we're seeing kind of the bottom of his shoe, which is about to step right on the face of the viewer. I guess that's what I'm best known for, as a cover boy of the New Yorker magazine over the years. My passion, really, my labor of love, because it doesn't pay nearly as well as the New Yorker does, is telling these stories as a storyteller. Some of them are longer than others. I've done 4 graphic novels over the years. I just published the most recent one, hot off the press, Naked City, a novel in pictures. Yeah, here it is. And it's by far the longest one. This one is 336 pages, longer than your typical comic book. And this one is serious. It's about some serious subject matter about being born and raised in New York City. But it also has a lot of comic relief. In fact, there's so much humor in this one that I'm calling it a comedy, and the publisher is marketing it as a comedy.
Excellent. Well, and it's interesting, too, that you mentioned how long it is, because I'm actually holding my copy of Flood, one of your other graphic novels, and I'm holding them side by side, and it's double the length.
There you go. Yes.
So it is a hefty tome, and when I got it in the mail, I was just delighted by the packaging. The amazing work that Dark Horse did on this particular press is beautiful. It is beautiful.
Printing and the production and the cover and all that. Hardcover, no less.
So before we get into the book, I feel like a little bit about your passion and connection to New York City in general is worth mentioning, because it really contextualizes you as the author of these graphic novels. So tell me a little bit about just briefly about your passion for New York City in general.
Well, as I say, I was born there, right, in Manhattan Island, and grew up in Lower Manhattan in the Lower East Side, what's now being called the East Village. The landlords rebranded this whole part of town and have tried to make it more upscale. But all of my, my old friends, my childhood friends, many of them are still there. And I spend a lot of time in New York, even though I divide my time. I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area at the present moment. But I do a lot back and forth. And what I noticed, and this was completely unexpected, is that once I went out to the West Coast, I saw New York City with a whole different perspective, a different set of eyeballs, really. When you're born in a place and grow up in a place, you don't really see, you almost take it for granted, or you think that the whole world is just like your neighborhood. So it wasn't until I got some distance from New York City that I was able to see it for the first time. And just in these recent years, just how unusual a place it is. And structure and the height of the buildings on all of that. I mean, that's what it's famous for, on Wall Street and all of that nonsense. But what really stuck with me is the people. New York City, the mixture of people that we have in New York City, I haven't encountered anything close to it in any other city. I mean, I'm about to go back to LA in a few days, and that's also very spread out. It's a much more horizontal city. Is everything is vertical. Los Angeles is like lying down in
Yeah.
a New York City in a reclining pose. And LA, everyone is in their cars the whole time. It's a total car culture. That's the other thing that I love about New York and took for granted about it is the public transportation. You get everywhere on the subway. I've never owned a car in my life. I finally learned how to drive at a certain point because it's a good skill to have.
Hmm.
But I believe in public transportation, and New York has best public transportation of any city in the U.S., if not the planet. The subway never stops. I don't know of any other subway system anywhere that runs 24/7 like that. This is including big cities like Tokyo. It stops at midnight.
Hmm.
Mexico City, the London Underground, they all stop at midnight for a few hours so they could kind of hose it down and get it ready for the commuters the next morning at 5, 6 a.m. New York City, it never stops. It's complete nocturnal 24/7 city. So that's very much what molded me. My whole consciousness and sense of the world was molded by growing up in that environment with that mixture of people, with dozens of languages being spoken all around me. In particular, the Lower East Side neighborhood that I grew up in was the well, at that time it was really the Latin Quarter. It was a
Mm.
Puerto Rican neighborhood. Before that, it was Yiddish speaking Jewish neighborhood. And before that, it was German. Before that, it was Irish. It's always going through changes. I mean, every big city always has waves of immigration. And that's kind of the natural course, for better or worse, of the cities in the US and I suppose around the world.
Excellent. Yeah. So let's chat about the novels, right? You've got this brand new book, Naked City, a graphic novel. I want to set the stage though, because the book is the third book in a trilogy. So we got Flood, Blood Song, and now Naked City. And for anybody who's looking at the video version, here's a copy of Flood that I'm holding up right here, which you can find if you do a little digging. What do listeners need to know about the first two books in the trilogy that will help
Mhm.
them with the third book?
Right. Well, I decided to call it a trilogy, although each book totally stands on its own. In
Hmm.
fact, it's not like the storyline continues into the next book. Each one is an individual, discrete tale. Thematically, the city is almost one of the characters in all three stories, and just the fact that there are three graphic novels told by the same author. I thought it occurred to me just as I was getting ready to publish this recent one that hey, if the author is calling it a trilogy, it's a trilogy.
Yes.
I guess the another theme that runs through all three, although in very different ways in each story, is music. I know you're a music lover, Greg, and
I am,
music has
yes.
played a large role in all three stories. This latest one, Naked City, is about a young singer songwriter, an aspiring musician, Isabel. She's the protagonist of this story, and it begins. We see her on the road. She's hitchhiking. She's leaving Detroit. She grew up evidently in the Midwest, and she hitchhikes all the way to the East Coast, comes to New York City, just with a few things she throws in a suitcase and her guitar. And she starts out as a street performer, just playing music on the streets, busking there on subway platforms, places like that, before she's ultimately discovered in the third chapter.
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting too about your mention that it's Detroit is that there's a drawing on page 10 where it shows the industrial setting. And I live in Buffalo, which is another
Mm,
Great Lakes city on Lake Erie, just like Detroit.
that's
Um,
right.
And so I was looking at this and I was like, this is exactly my view when I'm driving on the 190 going against the Niagara River, going north to south in Buffalo. And so to me, I was just like right in there on that Great Lakes Rust Belt setting early on in the book for Isabel. And I loved it. I was like,
Mm,
ah, this is home.
yes, well, it is a very similar landscape. Certainly, the Midwest and or even certain East Coast cities like Pittsburgh comes to mind, which was a boom town. You know, if you've ever visited Pittsburgh, it's hills, and then in the valley there's a river and all kinds of factories and old rusty iron bridges going over the river, and it's now, I wouldn't call it a ghost town, but it's no longer manufacturing anything to speak of. I mean, that's the transformation that's occurred in the U.S. in recent decades. You know, whether you're talking about the East Coast or the Midwest, but all those factories, virtually all of them, have closed down only because the corporations realized that if they moved south of the border or to somewhere like China, that they would be able to work around. They wouldn't have to pay people a fair shake each day.
Hmm.
So, thanks to the deregulation of, well, the Reagan years, and then it's accelerated, and now it's kicking into high gear with Trump 2.0,
Hmm.
where not only are they relocating, but going after anyone who tries to organize a labor union or to speak on behalf of working people or people who work in any of these factories, or even people who work in a service-based economy like McDonald's, where we see Isabel as the only job she's able to get at a certain point is if the local McDonald's, what do they call it? Willie D's. No,
Yeah.
Mickey D's is the only place she could find a job, or around the corner at the local topless bar.
Hmm.
That's when she decides she's going to leave town and throws a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and some loose guitar strings. It's always good to have some spare guitar strings, and hitchhikes and makes it all the way to the big city. And that's all just in the first few pages of the book. She has this long adventure, and the rest of the story all takes place there in New York City. She gets a
Yeah.
place out in Brooklyn. She lands her first gig, her first paying job, about 3 weeks after arriving there. But then she confesses that, well, it was really just an open mic, actually, a hole in the wall way out in Brooklyn. But still, it was her first chance to sing in front of a live audience. And she passes her hat around the crowd and makes a little pocket change. But she decides that coming home, even though it's snowing pretty hard, she's not going to pay for the subway. She has such little money in her pocket. She decides to walk home. And that's really where the story begins. She's walking home in the snow, and she realizes, no, this is cool. This gives me a chance to get my head together. She starts making plans.
Mm. You know, and you said a word a few minutes ago, transformation. And there's some other characters in this book too. Isabel going very much going through a transformation. There's a
Mm,
dancer in the book that Isabel befriends going through a transformation. There is an artist in the book very much going through a transformation. Tell me
yes.
a little bit about like how transformation kind of resonates with you with regards to the characters that we see in the book.
Well, all of my artist friends, including musicians, writers, poets, dancers, they're all of them going through some serious changes. Beyond the changes and transitions that all of us go through in this thing called life, right? I mean, we're always going through changes and transformation is always what makes for a good story. But above and beyond that, artists nowadays are really, really struggling uphill. I mean, this is the perennial question that the characters, all three artists, are asking in the story: is it possible to survive as an artist in the 21st century?
Mm.
All right, it's always been challenging to, to make a living from one's art. There's nothing new about that, but it was possible. We looked around and we saw that there were some examples we could point out. But at this point, when I look around at so many of my friends, some of them are amazing musicians, as great songwriters as you've ever seen. They're unable to pay their rent and pay for food through their art. They all have day jobs. There's nothing wrong with that, but it simply means they have less time to devote to making music or painting pictures or writing stories or practicing journalism even. I mean, ultimately, this extends to the entire workforce. It's not just artists. That's just the lens through which we're following in this story. We're following these three artists, but I guess the big expose is that artists are just working people who also need to pay their rent, even though we have this stereotype in this culture of the starving artist that, oh no, the artists, they're used to being broke. They still need to pay their rent every 4 weeks, and they need to pay for all utilities and all of these things that most people take for granted. So it's very much a look at that. It's just jobs, the different jobs people are forced to take, and take 2, 3 jobs at a time just to make ends meet.
Yeah. Well, and as an artist yourself, and as a person who knows a lot of artists, the artist character in the book really resonated with me, knowing that I was going to be talking to you. And the artist in the book has to paint a lot of stuff that he doesn't really feel a ton of passion for because it's what sells.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Right.
was just curious about your thoughts on that. You kind of alluded to that earlier too with the New Yorker covers. Like you probably love working for the New Yorker, I would imagine, because it's pretty cool. But it's also like, all right, gotta do this because I know what I got to do in order to survive.
That's right. Well, the Benjamins, as a wise man once said, it's all about the Benjamins. What's unusual about the New Yorker, and what I love working for them, is that they give you a lot of freedom. They don't really tell you. They make suggestions of images that they need for upcoming covers. It comes out every week, you know. So they're always scurrying to try to, be topical and come up with an image that suits the current news cycle that week. But the New Yorker is unusual in that it's virtually the last magazine that still allows artists on their cover.
Mm,
It happened very gradually, incrementally through the years. But if you look at a newsstand now, if you could find a newsstand in the 21st century, it's virtually all photography on the cover. Anything from Sports Illustrated to Time Magazine to Harper's, these publications that used to have illustrations on the cover half of the time. I mean, photography is nothing new. It's gradually been making its way onto magazine covers for the past century. But just in the last few years, these big corporate media giants have decided, screw it, we're just going with photography. We save lots of money that way. We don't have to pay artists. It'll take them several days, sometimes a whole week, to come up with a magazine cover. We could just buy a photograph that took 2 seconds to take, or we could just type it into artificial intelligence and get a passable editorial illustration on whatever subject keywords we type in. So
yeah.
that's the latest threat on the horizon. It's possibly the last nail in the coffin for illustrators. But the fact is, Greg, that visual artists have already been reeling for quite a while now because of this earlier technology called photography,
Mm-hmm.
which has been with us for a while, 150 years now. But I would say that artists never really did get quite on their balance after that. Just blow in the pocketbook from a pure labor point of view. Machines, wealthy people now had machines. At first, it was only rich people who could afford this new technology to take portraits of them. Why hire a painter like Rembrandt to paint a portrait of you when there's a machine that can do it?
Yeah.
right? And they've gotten cheaper and more ubiquitous in recent years. And now everybody has a phone built right into their phone in their pocket. So everybody's a photographer. So it's um, it's just kind of cheapened the whole field, even of photography. If everyone's a photographer, good luck trying to support yourself as a professional photographer.
Yeah.
And then as an illustrator, this they're going to hire a photographer before they hire you, because the photographer is able to create the picture much quicker than an illustrator will.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk about the creative process for Naked City. Um, when did this story start coming together in your mind? Because I'm curious, like this thing is huge, so much art in this, and so much writing. Tell me a little bit about how this started coming together for you, and like how long it took, and
Yeah.
just a little bit about the
Well, it was
creative
kind of a
process.
gradual process, of course, like any big, ambitious work of art. It kind of started slowly. I suppose the first things that people ask me, what came first? Did he write it and then do pictures to go with it? Or did the illustrations come first and then you added the word balloons and the captions? And it kind of went back and forth, but it started out really with the visual art. It started out with the characters several years back, just sitting there and just drawing pictures of little, just characters, people, without really having any agenda or know where I was going. I didn't have any direction I was heading in. But one of the first characters that intrigued me was this character guy. He's wearing a baseball hat. He's this working man. He's got kind of this rough, gruff, broad-shouldered fellow, and he washes windows for a living. We see him. He's always holding his squeegee in one hand. He's one of these squeegee men.
Here he
Yes,
is.
that character. I think he came to me first. I don't know why. It's ultimately mysterious, but he appeared on the page. In New York City, we have these squeegee men. They come up to you if you're in a car or in a taxi cab, and the cab stops at a red light. They'll come right up to the car and start spraying the window with a little soapy water and start squeegeeing and cleaning your window. And they do quite a nice job, even though your window is perfectly clean already. Thank you very much. Yeah, so everyone's always annoyed at them. The drivers often are very rude and say, "No, no, I don't need it. Get out of my way," And then the mayor, Giuliani, who was mayor at the time, decided to scapegoat these squeegee men. Specifically, he referred to them as aggressive squeegee men. Like, this is, of all the things you have to be worried about and anxious about, it's these aggressive panhandlers and aggressive squeegee men. But this was, of course, part and parcel of just the crackdown on the homeless population in cities across the country. And who were the homeless? Well, they're just working people who maybe missed a few days of work. Maybe they got sick from the COVID or who knows what. But they were just a paycheck away, and they got evicted. Virtually any homeless person you see in Buffalo or New York City or San Francisco at one time was a rent stabilized leaseholder. They had their
Mm,
paperwork, and you couldn't just evict them. You had to prove that that they hadn't paid their rent in a period of time or something like that. So I decided that this was a way of getting into some of the subject matter that I'm getting into now. That's always right in one's face if you live in a big city, and it gets to you. You're at all sensitive person, like most artists are. You're going to have a more difficult time tuning out some of these marginal characters. Most people have more of a filter up. They're just busy, and it's all about making the money. And you're an artist, you're giving yourself a little bit of extra time to absorb the landscape and keep your eyes open and see what's really going on. I think this is a prerequisite for being any kind of artist.
Yeah.
So this was the character that came to me first. I didn't know if that I was going to do a whole story about this squeegee man. What a strange thing to attempt to do a story about. But then a couple of other characters soon appeared on the page. This young woman, she's kind of cute. She looks like she couldn't be more than 18 or 19. If anything, she's maybe looking a little bit malnourished. We don't really know what her situation is, but she's unusual. She's dressed in this long black coat. She wears a pork pie hat, and she carries her guitar with her. She's some kind of musician or wannabe musician. So she appeared on the page. And then the other character who ended up being almost a protagonist in the story, maybe the antagonist of the tale, was this artist character. This dude, he just happens to look a little bit like yours truly, but it's not really me. It's almost a caricature of a more naive, younger version of myself. Even more so, it's a kind of a caricature of the stereotype of the artiste, like the 19th century French artiste, wearing the striped shirt, the beret and the whiskers, and painting oil on canvas, painting nudes, for a living, which at one time was possible. Even in our lifetimes, people were doing that. People continue to do it. I've been known to do it myself, Greg. But good luck trying to make a living being that kind of artist, trying to be a gallery artist or a museum artist. If you're lucky, after you die, your work might get a little increased value, and then you'll wind up in the galleries or museums. I mean, look what happened to our friend Jean-Michel Basquiat. Or Vincent van Gogh, for that matter. He sold one painting during his lifetime. He was struggling economically. So I'm telling that story as well, the artiste character. We never get his name. The young woman, her name is Isabel. We'll call her Izzy once she gets a little famous. Her first album is called Izzy. And, the squeegee man, I just called him Squeegee. I had a friend as a kid whose name was Squeegee. I don't know what that was about. But the other character who shows up later on in the first chapter is the street dancer, Alex.
Yeah.
Who is the most unusual looking. She's got this mohawk, spike hawk. She's kind of a punk rock, kind of hip hop punk rocker. It's not clear exactly where she's coming from, if it even is a she. If it's a he, his name is Alex. Sometimes it's a he. He appears to be black, but then Alex tells us that his mother is Jewish from the Bronx. So even Alex is partly a caricature of myself, because my mother was Jewish from the Bronx, an artist, but never supported herself with her painting or her music, was a public school teacher all my life. So I suppose all of these characters that appeared on the page a few years ago were just represented different facets of myself, male, female, older, younger versions of myself. And so I gave them different names. And after a while, they just took on a life of their own. I decided to just tell a story and use some word balloons this time, since the earlier volumes in this so-called trilogy were silent, right? Flood,
Right.
novel and pictures. The entire graphic novel was visual. There were no word balloons, no captions. It was more of a woodcut novel, or in that tradition, as was the second one, Blood Song. 300 pages, not a single word, no syllables at all, except, I suppose, the title, right?
Yeah.
This time around, I decided, okay, I think I've explored the wordless storytelling to the hilt. I want to play around with dialogue for a change. You can't really fake dialogue. And I always loved the different voices, especially in a city like New York, the different accents. And also just the the full vocabulary of comics, the fact that you could use words and pictures. You could have captions, you could have word balloons, or thought bubbles. You get to actually see what the different characters are thinking at any given moment. Sometimes what they're thinking is at odds with what the word balloon is, what they're saying. So that's always a revelation.
I have a question, just a technical weird thing that I just thought about. So you draw all of the paintings and the drawings that appear in the book, and
Mhm.
then do you draw the thought bubble by hand onto the drawing itself whenever you're doing the artwork?
I do. It's kind of a layered process where at first I sketch it in pencil on paper.
Yeah.
And then when I get that, pretty well composed on the page with all of the panels lining up and, uh, uh, having a regular pattern, but not too regular, right? You don't want it to be monotonous with all these
Hmm.
panels stacked up. You always want to have one of them a little off center, or a surprise at the end of each page. At that point, I whip out the pen and ink. I start inking it in, and that's when the music comes on. The beginning, I prefer silence. I don't want anything distracting me. But when I'm inking it in, that's almost the fun part. And then the words I add on a separate layer so that I could always change it. And to the very last moment, I'm always rewriting and changing what the characters are saying, or what they're thinking. Not to
Yeah.
mention the sound effects. That's another thing that I hadn't been using in my first two graphic novels, because they're words. I wanted to challenge myself. How much can I communicate? How much information can I put across without resorting to words? This time I've got the full language of comics: sound effects, the thought bubbles, the speech balloons, and the captions, and all of it. And even the style, I'm sure you've noticed, it's a lot more cartoony
Yeah.
than the previous books that were a little more serious in subject matter. This one is a full-on comedy. Some characters more than others. The painter character is really the cartooniest one. He's the comic relief of this story. In
Yeah.
fact, Isabel's story is kind of a serious, tragic tale, as we learn from some of her flashbacks that she's actually very traumatized from childhood. But I don't want to spoil any
Yeah.
for the
Totally.
readers.
Well, okay, so now what I want to talk about is I want to hear about your live events that you've been doing. I know you've been celebrating the release of the book in Portland, New York, San Francisco, Berkeley. You got Los Angeles coming up. Unfortunately, this won't be out in time for the Los Angeles event, but I would love to know about your process for promoting this book and getting out there on the road and doing events.
Yes, well, that's always a challenge, because they don't really do it. No one does it for you. I mean, the bookstores, they're kind enough to allow you in their store to do an author reading or signing. I decided to expand it, and it's not simply a reading, but I'm enacting, since it's a comedy. I'm acting out the different characters, kind of dramatizing it, and then even playing live music. I play a couple of instruments, so I make it into more of a entertaining or full blown cultural event, because I'm projecting slides behind it, and it kind of goes on. I'm calling it a cartoon concert. And I've been doing a series of these. Yeah, all East Coast, West Coast, New York. I was in San Francisco last week. I'll be in LA this coming Tuesday. Maybe I might schedule a few more events in the new year if I'm in the mood. If I don't, if I don't find myself like submerged in some new project. You never know when you're going to get sucked back into the next thing that takes all of your time and energy. But I'm thinking, maybe in the spring I'll do a few more of these events, because people always love the fact that it's such an entertaining event. It's not just a reading or a book signing or a slide lecture. That always sounds
Hmm.
pretty boring. Yes, come to this slide lecture on Tuesday night. How about come to a musical slide lecture? I'll go. come to that just out of curiosity. I never heard of a musical slide lecture before. So I've been just giving a series of these, and it's also very much in the spirit of the book, which has this musical theme running through it, and kind of multifaceted, multidimensional with all the different characters. Each character also represents a different strata of society, a different economic group, a different ethnic group, right? Which is what we see in big cities, especially like New York. In fact, white people are have always been the minority in New York when I was growing up anyway. I don't know if that's changed yet. I know that's certainly on the agenda. The Trump, Elon Musk agenda is to try to flip that script and have rich people taking over Manhattan Island and all of the big cities, and to push all of the working class into the suburbs. That's the trend we're seeing in the last couple of decades. The paradox for the ruling class that they're learning the hard way is if you push people too far away out of the city, they're not able to make it back in time the next morning to, clean your floors and cook your food and all of those things, harvest your crops and all those things. So you have to just push them to the outer line edges of the city so they could make it back within an hour, so they could, clean your toilets the first thing the next morning.
Right.
So it's reached an all-time extreme. I mean, it sounds dystopian, but I think this is unfortunately exactly the situation we find ourselves in now. And it's not like we weren't warned. I mean, back in the middle of the last century, we had some of the best writers and artists like George Orwell, giving these cautionary tales, or Aldous Huxley, back almost a century ago, wrote Brave New World. And all along, the 21st century has been taking on a distinctly dystopian flavor. You can't really miss it. And I think now we're taking a quantum leap. The wool was pulled over the eyes of enough of the American public to just not even bother to vote. I think that's the biggest voting demographic, is people who felt, who just were not enthusiastic, that couldn't even really differentiate. Oh, Trump's bad, Trump's a Nazi. Well, what's your program? What's your agenda? Well, they couldn't really articulate it very well, could they? In fact, they didn't seem to be making that much of an effort.
Yeah.
That was a little mysterious. Some would say suspicious. It was almost in hiding, like it was a non-campaign they were conducting. And after all, it's all the ruling class. The Democratic Party is as much the ruling class as the Republican Party is, but they do represent different wings of the ruling class that is in conflict with each other, just like the left wing. What little there is of active left in the U.S. seems to be bitterly divided, and has been for quite a while. Different factions of the left. This group of progressives is arguing with this group. Is it class? Is it race? This is a white supremacist society. Well, yes, thanks a lot, Sherlock. I hadn't noticed that. But what are we going to do about it? Maybe we should find the things that unite all working people, whatever color or gender they are, and focus on class, the class dynamic. But that voice never really gets amplified too well. I think we hear way more about the racial animosity, which is undeniable, but we seem to be so fixated on that as a culture that we never get to the part of, what we have in common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, these are themes that are always swimming in my head, being a city dweller, that I put into the book and that I try to weave right into the narrative in a way that the readers will find very familiar and probably identify with, but also will gives a certain perspective, kind of shows the absurdity of it all and the futility of it all, even the futility of making art. The poor painter, after a while, he's successful painting these buildings and cityscapes. He has these gallery shows. He's making a lot of money, but then after a while, he gets tired of it.
Yeah.
Even though he's able to pay his rent, he's burned out doing it. He wants to try something new, just to challenge himself creatively. And he starts painting the nude, painting from the human figure, which, after all, is a tradition in Western art. He decides to go for it. And that's when he meets the protagonist, Isabel, who by this time is so desperate for rent money that she gets a job working as an artist's model. And she poses for the painter for money. And this kind of relationship develops between the two of them, which I'm not going to give away, but it's almost a triangular relationship develops between Isabel and the painter and then the street dancer.
Yeah. Well, I love it. I read it in one sitting.
Wow.
I was in the 17th floor of a building overlooking Lake Erie in downtown Buffalo, and I read the entire thing in one sitting. So I loved the setting that I read the book in because I was overlooking a cityscape as well while I
Mm-hmm.
was reading the book, and it really added a lot of dimension for me. So if anybody out there gets this book, I highly recommend reading it from high up in a building because it really enhances the experience. But Eric, Eric Drooker, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow along with your variety of artistic creativity that you've been putting into the world for so many
Yeah, well,
years now.
if people are curious, if they can't already familiar with the work, just look at my website, drooker.com, just my last name, and you'll right away see, hundreds of images from this book. Kind of, I give a sneak preview so you can see what the story looks like and what the different characters we're describing look like. And then when you look at, if you click on, well, New Yorker covers, for instance, you'll see dozens of covers that I've done over the years, and that those will be the most familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Just about everyone has seen them just sitting there in the dentist's office, right? I mean, most of us don't subscribe to the New Yorker magazine, but you see it around. Oh, you'll see it on the newsstand. And in that regard, I think of my New Yorker covers as street posters, as full color street posters, because it it dawned on me one day that the vast majority of people who look at the New Yorker cover aren't buying or reading the magazine. They're just seeing it. They're just seeing it sitting there or on a newsstand or yeah, at the doctor's office in a waiting room or somewhere, So most people they just see it. And as I mentioned, the New Yorker is virtually the only publication now in 21st century America that has art on the cover, that allows artists to create the cover. Everything else has become dominated by photography. And if there are some of the New Yorker covers that are familiar, and you go, oh yes, yes, I remember that one. In fact, I have that one taped to my refrigerator, or my mother has that on her refrigerator. And you like the style, or you like the ironic perspective of the artist, and you want to get into something a little bit more narrative than just a single painting. Naked City expands on that. It's 300 pages, and each page is divided into several panels, right? Because it's the medium of comics I'm working in. Each page has what would you say, 3, 4, 5
For
panels,
sure.
individual drawings in them. So if they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, 300 times, well, you do the math. But it's a good read. It'll keep you busy for a while. I haven't encountered too many people before you, Greg, that told me they read the whole thing in one sitting. But
Yeah,
hey, I've
I
always
went
been
for it.
a slow reader, especially graphic novels, because I like to look at the pictures for a long time. And a
Yeah.
book that's 300 pages, even a picture book, I'll I'll put a bookmark in there and get back to it the next day. It'll take me a few days to get through it.
Well, I do got to say that even though I read it in one sitting, the coolest thing about it is the complexity of the artwork because it makes it tremendously readable and re-watchable, so to speak. So Eric Drooker, author and artist of Naked City, a graphic novel, Flood, Blood Song. Everybody check out Drooker.com. Thank you so much for joining me and chatting about this brand new book. I have
Hey,
had
thanks
a
so much for
blast.
having me, Greg. I feel like we got deep into some of the themes here. And if your appetite was whet out there, if the listeners are curious about any of these themes, check it out. You could just see it right away on the website. And it's available wherever books are sold. If they don't have it in your local bookstore, just order it. Or if you want a signed copy for no extra expense with a little drawing that I'm putting in there, an original drawing, you could just do that through the website. If you order it through drooker.com, you'll get a signed copy with an original drawing in there. So you can't really go wrong. And I think it'll keep most people busy for a while. Even if you're a quick reader, you'll buzz through it, let it wash over you the first time just for pure entertainment. And then the second or third time, then you'll start to see certain of the patterns, and you'll start to see certain things, some of the twists that you didn't notice in the first reading.
Fabulous. Well, Eric Drooker, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. It's great to see you again, Greg.